I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. And today is our first event for the China and the World program, our first speaker event for the 2020 to 2021 academic year. And as I do at the beginning of every academic year, I want to thank Daniel Sahensky for his excellent organizational work putting together our speaker series and running our program. I wanted to thank the Weatherhead Center, especially Athena, who's put this session together. And we're really lucky today to have as our first speaker for the year, Abraham Denmark. He's the director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, D.C. And he's also a senior fellow at that center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. He also teaches, which is a big emphasis in our program, at the Walsh School at Georgetown University. So a lot of students benefit from his wisdom. And today he's going to be presenting his new book, and we're really excited about it. It's called U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century, Empowering Allies and Partners. Abe is a scholar. He's also a public servant. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration. And he's worked on national security affairs at other think tanks like the National Bureau of Asian Research. And I can say that I worked with him in the government on issues like cybersecurity and China's military power back in the Bush administration when he was working at the Pentagon. He's won a scad of medals, including the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. And he has an educational background from his home state in Colorado, both at the University of Northern Colorado and at the Korbel School at the University of Denver. He's also studied in Beijing at Peking University. So it's just a tremendous honor to introduce someone who really brings together all of the elements of the China and the World program as we envision it, which is a combination of scholarship on important issues related to China's foreign relations and practical application of that understanding to the policy world. And Abe really embodies all of those virtues that the China and the World program is designed to promote. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Abe. Abe, welcome. It's great to have an old friend start the year off.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's just a thrill and an honor to join you, to speak at your program, to join China and the World program again. Thank you so much for having me. Daniel, thank you so much for helping me get this program together, and your patience in dealing with me and my distracted child, overwhelmed state. Very much appreciate all of your willingness to work with me and to host me for this event. Just a thrill and an honor. I'm actually speaking not from my house. I'm in an Airbnb in West Maryland, pretty much West Virginia. Thus the background is not my usual background, but it should be child-free for the entirety of our call. To show my bona fides, I have a duck next to me to show that I'm actually at an Airbnb in rural Western Maryland. But the internet connection is very strong, so I think this should work great. I'm going to be presenting the main findings of this book with the goal of leaving plenty of time for us to be able to have a discussion and receive some questions from the audience. So I will share the briefing slides. As a product of the Pentagon, I always have slides for everything. And we can get started there. I hope this is working. Okay, got it. There we go. Again, thank you all just for joining us. Thank you for joining me. I'm very excited to be able to talk about this. First piece I should mention, though, as a person who works at the Wilson Center, the findings of this book, this presentation is my views alone, not of the Wilson Center or of Columbia University Press who published it, or of the US government. Just my views alone. Important to make sure that that's clear with everybody. So a little bit about the origins of this book. I actually started it far too long ago than I'd usually like to admit, in 2015. And the original project was to think about getting our allies and partners in Asia to do more. And for me, it was an opportunity to dig into that subject, since it's been a topic of pretty much every alliance manager since these alliances were established. And I was having a bit of a tough time getting started in terms of figuring out the angle, the analytic angle of what became this book. And so in April of 2015, I was invited to attend the arrival of Japanese Prime Minister Abe to the White House. He and President Obama signed new defense guidelines for cooperation, which renewed the military alliance between Japan and the United States to be broader, deeper, more effective at meeting current and emerging challenges. And something that President Obama said really stuck with me and helped me find the angle on this book. When he said, quoting here, that ours is an alliance focused on the future. And when I looked at the agreement that the two presidents endorsed, it was not just about military cooperation, but they discussed trade, human rights, climate change. But he also noted that the Prime Minister's visit had historical significance, that 55 years earlier, in 1960, President Eisenhower welcomed Prime Minister Abe's grandfather, Prime Minister Kishi, to the White House. And they had signed the security treaty that endures to this day, committing America and Japan to what they referred to as an indestructible partnership. And thinking about this and reading about it after the event, one of the pieces that struck me was how difficult it must have been for both men to sign that agreement, and that Eisenhower had been initially elected to get the United States out of a war in East Asia, and here he was committing the United States to defend an ally from aggression in the same region. And for Prime Minister Kishi, this was a deeply unpopular move for him that eventually led to his resignation as Prime Minister. Moreover, it must have been difficult for them personally, in that they both played significant roles in the Second World War as enemies just 15 years earlier. But they saw that the needs of their country required them to put the past aside and move ahead for the benefit of their countries, and they did. And it was that history and the adjustments to the alliance that in April of 2015 that really struck me and helped me and inspired me to write the book. And that they're a reminder to me that alliances and strategies have to change with the times, or else they risk irrelevance and potentially failure. And so that's what this book is about. It's about that the Indo-Pacific remains the most geopolitically significant region in the world, but its rise, and especially the rise of China, represent a fundamental change and challenge to the balance of power, and a challenge to the post-war liberal order. So this book seeks to explain the nature of this change, its implications for the United States, and how Washington can adjust its approach to ensure that American power and leadership in the Indo-Pacific can be sustained well into the future. So the presentation's organized a bit differently than the book, but the four core arguments of the book is first to just try to define what US and China are competing over in Asia, arguing that it's about, we're competing over power and order. And I'll be getting into these ideas later on. Second, that shifts in the regional balance of power threaten the foundations of the post-war liberal order. Third, that the United States strategy has to evolve in order to reflect changes to the balance of power and to these threats to the liberal order, and describes a strategy to revitalize the liberal order for the 21st century, and specifically the role that our allies and partners should take in advancing US strategy along these lines. So the first argument, the first point I wanted to make that I make in the book is to differentiate the concepts of power and order. And this is in part coming out of some frustrations that I've had, having sat in innumerable meetings with Chinese interlocutors, especially, in which I'd found that both sides were talking about different things, but in a way that we were sort of talking past each other, in that American scholars would often talk about their concerns about China's orientation towards the established international order, whereas the Chinese were concerned that the United States was trying to contain Chinese power. And the two concepts are certainly interrelated, but I wanted to make sure that we were clear when we're talking about power and order, because the book treats them as separate but related subjects. When we talk about power of a nation or a group of nations, that it's rooted in their national characteristics, their wealth, political stability, military might, etc., as well as the ability of their national leaders to translate these characteristics into influence on the world stage. Whereas order, on the other hand, is more of the rules of the road. I've heard another scholar refer to it as the operating system of the international system, in which the laws, norms, and institutions that states use to shape their behavior of other states, and that tries to channel disputes over competitive or contradictory interests into more diplomatic modes of dispute resolution. They're related especially in Asia, in that the power of a country or group of countries to create, sustain, shape, or undermine a given international order really defines the character of that order in the region. So in the book, I won't belabor the point in the presentation, but in the book, it describes a bit how changes to the balance of power in Asia resulted in changes to the regional order, be it a Sinocentric system driven by Chinese hegemonic power, or a more Japanese-centered system with the rise of Imperial Japan and their efforts to establish a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. But the key point here is that the Indo-Pacific's distribution of power historically, and I would argue still, shapes the nature of the regional order, the rules of the road, and how states interact with one another. And so looking at the order in Asia since the end of the Second World War, the book describes it, as do many others, as the post-war liberal order, in which shared laws, norms, and institutions are used as a powerful force that was conducive for trade, investment, and economic development. It's also important to note that after 1953, Asia avoided direct major power wars, in part because of the post-war liberal order that was established and channeled competitive dynamics and allowed states to focus more on their economic development rather than on old forms of military competition. The brilliance of this order, to my mind, was that it served American interests, preserving and advancing American power and leadership. But it was also in the interests of countries around the world, and especially in Asia, that were able to develop their economies in a relatively stable external environment. And this region was greatly beneficial for Asia. And when we talk about the rise of Asia, the rise of China, to me, it's impossible to talk about the rise of this region without talking about the role of the liberal order that enabled its rise, from Japan and Korea to the Asian tigers in Southeast Asia, and more recently, India and China. Each, of course, owes their development to the decisions of their leaders, to the hard work of their people, but also to the international environment that facilitated their rise and their relative stability of their external environment. But today, despite the benefits of this order for the United States and for the rest of the Indo-Pacific, one of the ironic results, I should say, is that the success of this order has been, the results of this success has been the emergence of new challenges to the health and success of that liberal order, that the liberal order that's been so productive and helpful for these countries are coming under challenge. And the book identifies two interrelated developments. First is deepening uncertainties about the sustainability and reliability of American power in the region. And second has been the rise of China. China's ambitions as it relates to international order and its own power. So first, talking about uncertainty about the United States, that the region, broadly speaking, is concerned about the sustainability and reliability of American power, that this has been going on for several years, for quite a long time, in terms of the relative and absolute economic challenges that the United States faces, the budgetary pressures in terms of rising debt, and questions about the sustainability of large defense budgets, but also in terms of the reliability of American power, that many in the region fear that the United States is prone to strategic distraction, and questions about whether the United States is still committed to its role in the world as an agenda setter and as the dominant power. And that these uncertainties have been exacerbated by several events and trends in recent years, which I have listed there on the right. I started first hearing about concerns of American decline surrounding the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Of course, it wasn't the first time there were concerns about American decline. There's same story in the 1970s, same story in the 1950s and 60s. But from my experience, it was in 2008, 2009 when this discussion came up again, in large part because of the economic hit that the United States and the rest of the West took, whereas China seemed to be able to better weather the economic turbulence of that time. And many of the Asian economies somewhat reoriented their trade relationships and economic relationships to be closer to China they've been doing that beforehand, but this sort of accelerated that dynamic. Similarly, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan emphasized and exacerbated concerns about American strategic distraction, whereas the United States, American officials for a long time had been saying that Asia was the most critical region of the world, that we're committed to remaining focused on there, yet we're fighting these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with questionable strategic utility. But more recently, to my mind, exacerbating concerns about the United States and the sustainability and reliability of our power and influence in the region has been the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy, President Trump's questioning about the fairness, fairness of our alliances, his skepticism about their utility, his discussions about whether or not the United States would actually fulfill its treaty obligations in the defense of its allies, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the book doesn't address COVID-19. It was sent to the publisher before all this started, but it does, I think, have some important things to say about it. In fact, it didn't really occur to me the applicability of this book to the post-coronavirus world until I actually got one of the blurbs that was provided was from former Deputy Secretary of State Rich Armitage, who said that this book is a blueprint for the post-coronavirus world, and that really struck me, and it really flattered me, and it struck me that the idea of working with allies and partners on shared objectives and raising concerns about China fits directly within both the COVID-19 piece, but also the broader themes of this book. And when it comes to uncertainty about American power, I think the COVID-19 pandemic speaks to, exacerbates these concerns primarily because of the I would say, disastrous US response to the pandemic, raising concerns about basic competence of the United States and our ability to address these challenges, but also about the role that America wants to play in the world. And that we haven't been setting the agenda in international fora. If you may recall the G7 meeting to address and develop a worldwide strategy to fight the coronavirus pandemic, the United States actually played the role of spoiler, refusing to sign a joint statement coming out of the meeting because the rest of the other parties wouldn't agree to use the term Wuhan virus. And that, I think, sent a signal about American unwillingness to lead, as did the United States withdrawing from the WHO in the middle of the worst pandemic in living memory. So I think they're sort of exacerbating pre-existing trends is the way I would frame that. But the other piece of this, that I'd like to emphasize to you all, and I'm just, my computer just decided to stop showing me what I was showing you, is the rise of China and what that means for the rest of the region. Now, for those of you who don't follow China stuff on a daily basis, I wanted to focus and give a basic explanation of the implications of China's rise, and especially what China wants, what China's trying to achieve. And I actually very much appreciate the opportunity that that Tom and the China in the World program offered to me, and that part of the argument here I presented at a previous China in the World meeting, and those discussions really helped me hone and refine my arguments in the book here. So as Xi Jinping came to power, one of the phrases that the Chinese started using more was this concept that's written at the top here. The Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, which is just as much word salad in English as it is in Mandarin. And so it got me asking Chinese scholars, Chinese officials that I would meet with as an academic, what is this new era? What does that mean? And the best answer that I heard, to me was the most interesting answer that I heard was this dynamic, that under Mao, China stood up, under Deng Xiaoping, China got rich, and under Xi Jinping, China will grow powerful. That China will take the wealth and power that it had accumulated under Deng Xiaoping and the independence that it has achieved under Mao and really start to use its national power. But there was also very little sense of what China actually wanted. What was China trying to gain out of this? What Xi Jinping will say is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is the term that he uses a lot, that the Chinese government uses a lot. What I say for an American audiences when they're thinking about China and US-China competition is that China is a major power unlike any that we've seen before, unlike any other competition that we've had. And I don't mean this in sort of a unknowable, distant challenger, but rather that a lot of their foreign policy is domestically motivated, that it's shaped by the history and ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, and that as a result of this, it pursues what I describe in the book as an exceptionalist approach to international order. And what does that mean? It means first that this approach implicitly rejects what many of us assume to be the sovereign equality of nations, in that it believes it suggests and assumes a hierarchical approach to international order, in that there are big states and there are small states, and big states can do what they will and small states must suffer what they must. And what that means in terms of the vision for international system, there really hasn't been a clear and authoritative description from Chinese sources on what they're actually trying to achieve in terms of what their vision for an international system would be. But the way I describe it in the book, piecing together pieces from different places, is to establish China to be at the center of an informal hierarchical system in which China is regionally dominant, globally influential, in which every major strategic decision that has to be made with China's views in mind. That Beijing has a say in every issue of consequence. What one hears from Chinese diplomats, the way I tend to describe this, is this phrase that I put up here, Hebutong, which means harmony, not uniformity. It's a reference to an old Confucian aphorism, but what this basically translates to is that from Beijing's view, China does not seek to explicitly dominate international relations, but only to ensure that the rest of the world can live in harmony with China as it pursues its interests. And a great example of this happened a few months ago, actually, when the current Chinese ambassador to the United States appeared on Fareed Zakaria's TV show on CNN. Zakaria did a very effective job of pressing him on China's oppression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, its violation of one country, two systems in Hong Kong, its assertiveness in the South China Sea. And the Chinese ambassador's response I thought was very telling. And I'll quote here, quote, "The fundamental question for the United States is very simple. Is the United States ready or willing to live with another country with very different culture, very different political and economic system? Whether the United States is ready to live with it in peace and cooperate on so many and still growing global challenges. I think this is a real choice. This is a fundamental choice for people that people have to make," end quote. So when I run that through my universal translator, what that means is that China has every right to do what it believes it needs, and the world must come to terms with that. And that it assumes that the United States objects to China's rising power, an important difference again between power and order. The idea is that it's not China's job to adjust to the world, but rather it's dependent on the world whether or not they're going to adjust to China. In that their goal is to adjust aspects of the international order to reflect the interests and needs of the Chinese Communist Party. This is not a revolutionary or even explicitly revisionist approach to international relations. They're not trying to overthrow the UN or get rid of the World Bank, but rather they're trying to carve out exceptions for themselves when they find institutions or laws run counter to the interests and needs of the Chinese Communist Party, which is why I call it an exceptionalist approach to foreign affairs. It's different than American exceptionalism, which is based on the idea that the United States plays a vital and special role in the world because of our ideas, but rather it's more of a civilizational sense that China is important because it's China, because of its history, because of its civilizational status. And so you can see that reflected in a lot of different instances in which, in international institutions, China says that, it's still a developing country because it's so special and different than any other country, even though it's the second largest economy in the world. But as a Pentagon person, what most strikes me in terms of an exceptionalist approach to order is its approach to freedom of navigation in international waters, where Chinese military ships sail close to American islands in Alaska. They sail close to Japanese islands. They sail close to other countries' landmasses in Southeast Asia as well, as is completely consistent with international law. Yet when other countries' militaries sail close to what China claims to be its land, its maritime claims, especially in the South China Sea, China objects to that and says that it's violating Chinese sovereignty. And in my experience, when I ask Chinese scholars about this distinction, their fallback is to talk about Chinese exceptionalism, saying we completely support international freedom of navigation, but these places are especially sensitive. This is Chinese claimed water, so we need to have it shouldn't apply in these special circumstances. And so to me, that shows an exceptionalist approach to international affairs, that they're not trying to overthrow things, but rather to carve out exceptions for themselves when it suits their interests. But ultimately, this is a revisionist approach in that it demands weakened or compliant international laws and institutions, but also a circumscribed role for the United States in the Indo-Pacific, in the sense of China trying to establish its dominance in the region. So for US allies and partners, the focus of the book, this really creates a strategic conundrum in that the United States is a critical security partner, but China is a critical economic partner. China is increasingly ambitious and concerning, but not terribly supported amongst most of our allies and partners. So the United States is broadly seen positively, though Pew polling shows that President Trump is not very popular amongst our allies and partners, with a few exceptions. The United States is still seen rather positively, especially when it comes to China. And that they continue to look to the United States for leadership in the region, despite all the challenges that I mentioned before. And the way I've seen this happen in real life has been as a scholar in conferences, where I've been to innumerable conferences in Asia where we spend a day, 2 days with every speaker talking about the problems of the United States, that we're distracted, that we don't have enough resources, that we're not making the right decisions, all the things that we hear about the United States. But at the end, when people are asked, so what do we need to do as Asian states, the answer is almost always, we need the United States. We need to bring them back. We need to engage them, do what we can. And because really, as Madeleine Albright said, we're the indispensable power. But I prefer the story of Lord Carrington from NATO, telling the Europeans who are complaining about the United States, saying, yes, but they're the only Americans we've got. And I still think that's how our Asian allies and partners especially see us. They're generally uncomfortable with an idea of US-China explicit competition, but mostly because of the pressure that it may put on them to abandon a hedging strategy, and that one country or the other, that either the United States or China would try to pressure them to choose sides in this competition, which usually means instead of siding with one, it means siding against the other, which is something that's completely counter to the strategy that they're adopting that I'm going to be describing in a moment. That's not to say that they don't like American strength. In fact, many countries across the region have actually been fairly supportive of the Trump administration's approach to its language on China and its willingness to accept competition as a driving factor of its foreign policy, but rather they've been concerned about implementation and whether or not the president truly believes in the implications of a truly competitive relationship with China. So the book goes into describing what the Indo-Pacific's geopolitical dynamics are going to look like in the future, in the coming U.S.-China competition. And what it argues is that it describes what it refers to as a heterarchy, in which a series of interlocking hierarchies, in which they try to measure which country, the United States or China, has a better, stronger, which country has an advantage across multiple measures of national power. On the slide, we have trade communities, security mechanisms, technology standards, infrastructure, in which both sides are developing alternative ecosystems, basically, and that allies and partners will be looking to hedge their strategies, hedge their relationships by picking and choosing based on what they perceive to be in their best interest. So, it's in this sort of scenario, it's plausible to see some allies choosing to go with Chinese infrastructure, but wanting to align with the United States in the security and technology standards sphere. And what it means for the United States in terms of our strategy and engaging with allies has been that we need to be able to compete with the Chinese across all these elements of national power. The competition is much more than military competition. The book describes these as functional spheres of influence. And I think that's a helpful way of talking about these pieces. So that drives a strategy for our allies and partners of what the book refers to as complex hedging, in that these allies are not looking to do one of these strategies, be it external balancing with the United States or internal balancing or bandwagoning with China, or I should say engaging China, but rather all elements at the same time in order to deal with the tremendous uncertainties that they're faced with a rising and aggressive China and uncertain United States. So you'll see countries across the spectrum pursuing all aspects of these strategies, including countries like Japan that are very closely aligned with the United States, still trying to maintain at least some degree of engagement with China, external balancing with the United States, without the United States, internal balancing by investing more in their domestic and indigenous capabilities. And this is the environment where the United States is going to be operating. Now, I already talked about polling. I won't delve into it too much, except for this piece from Pew polling that I thought was especially important, that countries across Asia and around the world expect that China is going to be more powerful than the United States in the future, but they still would like to see the United States as the leading power in the region by several orders of magnitude, more than triple the numbers. So that to me is a cause for optimism from an American perspective. So from the views of our allies, they comparing and contrasting, they see the United States as a security provider, that we provide public goods, but they're concerned about the inconsistency of our engagement, that geographically we're just distant, which exacerbates the concerns about consistent engagement, and that we're distracted. Whereas they see the Chinese as self-interested economic powers, but they're close and they're engaged consistently and they're focused. But there's also questions about the capability of both sides. And it's unclear especially in the military realm, which side is going to be able to maintain an advantage. And this, again, just drives more hedging strategies. Now, switching to sort of from an American perspective, what this all means is that I titled the book "The Asian Century" and not the Chinese century very intentionally, because to me the story is not about the rise of China, but about the rise of Asia, in which China is a part. But if you look at the economies of the rates of growth for the previous 5 years across the region, it's not just U.S. allies, but also several U.S. partners that are whose economies are growing at a faster rate than the United States. Some at as fast, if not faster, than China. And that to me means if you dig into other dynamics, that our allies can be tremendous assets in our competition with China across different realms of national power. So just keeping our focus on economics, if you look at projected GDP or past GDP, for the example, China surpassed the United States, depending on your unit of measurement, in this unit of measurement by 2013, 2014. Whereas because of the rates of growth, if you take the United States and add our allies and partners, we still have tremendous advantages when it comes to China, just in terms of sheer economic throw weight. So to me, this raises the question, what does this all mean for an American strategy? What is the strategy that the United States should adopt to address these dynamics? And so what the book suggests is to identifies the objectives of the U.S. should be to counteract challenges to the regional balance of power, to oppose China's exceptionalist objectives, and to revitalize the 21st century liberal order. And basically what that involves is to rebuild American geopolitical strength and to empower our allies and partners. Now, I'll focus more on the latter. The first one basically is a way to differentiate this strategy, and why I think it's important differentiation from past efforts that we've seen to really get our allies and partners to do more, specifically the Nixon Doctrine, which did not fare well. To me, the key message here is that this is not a strategy to allow the United States to leave or to distance itself from Asia, but rather as a complement to a U.S. re-engagement in the region, that we need to invest in ourselves in the region as much as our allies should invest there as well, by rebuilding the true roots of American geopolitical strength. And the framework that it proposes is to revitalize the liberal order for the 21st century, to allow liberal orders to evolve, that we can't just go back to the way things have been, but rather we need to adjust the liberal order to reflect changes to the balance of power, to reflect and address current challenges that we face, but based on the liberal principles that have been critical to the success of the post-war order. That we need to empower our allies and partners to contribute to that regional order, revitalize our American power at home, I mentioned before, and to reconceive competition with China. And by that last point, I'll get to each of these points in order, actually. When I talk about revitalizing the liberal order for the 21st century, that the basis of the future order cannot be based on China and China's ambitions, but rather on the shared vision of the United States, our allies and our partners, based on liberal principles such as common rules and norms, liberal economic systems, and adopting participatory democratic systems of government. But we also need to develop new norms and new laws and potentially even new institutions for emerging technologies, reforming those old institutions as we need, enhancing governance and infrastructure across the region, both to help our allies and partners do more, but also because that's an effective way to compete against China. And the book makes the argument that China's efforts to grow its influence in the region is going to be especially successful in areas where governance is limited, where corruption is rife, where infrastructure is in dire need. And so we can compete with China in these areas by enhancing governance, by having our own compelling alternative to what China has been offering. By empowering our allies and partners, it means moving beyond the traditional hub and spoke approach to a more networked approach that encourages multilateral and minilateral cooperation, both with the United States and among our allies and partners. But it also means moving beyond security, that instead of thinking of alliances primarily as military institutions, but thinking of them more as a platform for coordination and cooperation across all elements of national power. And that our objective with having the hub and spoke network as having the hub and spoke as our foundation, using a networked efforts to cooperate among like-minded nations towards shared interests in all elements of national power. In terms of revitalizing American power at home and abroad, it means what the book describes. It's a pretty long list, but actually enhancing our participation in international institutions. The book was written before the United States pulled out of the WHO, but to my mind, when the United States pulled out of the WHO, the reason was that China had grown too influential. Nobody that I could tell actually asked the question why China had grown so influential and what the United States had been doing to counteract that. It may have had something to do with the fact that for over 2 years, we didn't have an ambassador appointed to represent the United States at the World Health Assembly. So to me, the answer to Chinese competition is not to take our toys home and leave, but rather to double down and to really deepen our engagement in international institutions, to deepen our engagement with ASEAN and other multilaterals. We still have not had a US ambassador to ASEAN for the entire Trump administration, to deploy more diplomats and more foreign military assistance to China, rather than actually diminishing the role of our diplomats. I mentioned governance before and fighting corruption as a competitive strategy as well as a liberal strategy, and to enhance the capabilities of our allies and partners, and to tailor them to what they need. Too often, the United States, what we offer to our allies and partners is too expensive and frankly too capable for what a lot of these smaller developing countries need. But we can work with some of our more advanced allies and partners, with Japan, with Australia, who are trying to develop their own defense industries so that they could produce something that's more affordable, less capable, but something that would be tremendously beneficial, both for the developing countries, but also to our strategy to allow them to defend themselves better, to contribute more to shared interest, and to counteract potential efforts of Chinese coercion. And finally, to reconceive competition with China. One of my concerns with the Trump administration, although I've been glad that they've been open about the competitive dynamics with China that we have, is that there really hasn't been a clear sense of what we're trying to achieve from that competition. Rather, it seems to be an end in itself, in that I've seen several leaders in the Trump administration talking about and emphasizing how the U.S. actions have hurt the Chinese economy and diminished Chinese trade numbers. But that really isn't a goal, as far as I know, is to limit Chinese trade numbers. I think there's a broader goal rather than we run faster than you, but rather what are we actually trying to achieve here? And what the book suggests is that one of our objectives should be to preserve a liberal order, to emphasize values and the quality of our engagements, that the liberalism of our system is our strength, not a weakness, that our allies are a strength and not a weakness, and to offer a compelling alternative to Chinese systems and initiative. Too many times I've feared that when we talk about with our allies and partners about China, it's in a very negative form of competition, of that trying to stop the Chinese from doing something, be it stopping our allies from allowing Huawei into their networks, or stopping them from allowing the Chinese to build a port or port facility. Now, of course, there's going to have to be some aspects of negative competition, of trying to stop the Chinese from doing something that's especially sensitive. But there also needs to be a positive agenda that, especially for more developing countries that need that sort of investment that the Chinese offer, we need to have something in its play that we can offer instead of Chinese investment, instead of Chinese 5G technologies. And for too long, we really haven't had that. And I think that's a challenge in our ability to compete, not just in the military sphere, but in all elements of national power. We need that compelling alternative. And finally, we need to have the confidence to compete. I think that in my experience and in my readings, when countries have a fair choice to make, which governance is clear, in which the United States has an option, China presents an option, we're going to win the vast majority of those competitions. The United States is just a better deal. The West, liberalism, transparency, quality, predictability, rule of law is a better option than what the Chinese offer. Countries would much rather be in business with us than with the Chinese Communist Party. That means we need to have that confidence to put ourselves up against the Chinese and give our allies and partners the option to make that choice. Because I think more often than not, we're going to win that competition. In the military lane, the slide talks about U.S.-Japan alliance, but it can talk about a lot of different pieces as well. The book actually goes country by country to our allies and partners, so I won't delve too much into country by country. We can talk about those in Q&A if there's interest, but basically it looks at enhancing what our allies and partners can do in the military sphere, economically, politically, how we can work with one another, building off of their strengths, their interests, and their efforts, and their interests. And this is the final point I'll make here, is that for the United States, I think as we engage with our allies and partners on these issues, here we go. We need to address the region for what it is in our strategy. That many of our allies and partners have some built-in allergies to talk of competition with China. That there's, for allies, especially like India, Indonesia, there is no interest in being a pawn of the United States in their competition with China. They are on their own side. They want to be independent. And I think the United States needs to meet them there, and that believe that a truly independent India, a truly independent Indonesia, whatever the country may be, is a strategic asset for the United States. If we're able to work together towards liberal ends, if we're able to work together on issues related to China, that we can achieve a lot if we're able to tailor our messaging, tailor our strategies to the interests and sensitivities of each country, rather than sitting in a room and telling everybody you need to get on board against China, which I don't think is going to help us very much. But ultimately, I still think we're best positioned to lead. I think we have the most credibility to lead in the region. But as China grows more powerful, we're not going to be able to do it alone. That our allies and partners are critical assets to our strategy. The book identifies alternative paths if we don't try to empower our allies, if we don't try to buttress this international system, be it ever-expanding unilateralism, where we're just doing more and more on our own, which becomes increasingly unsustainable, or we accept a more diminished role for the United States, which would be detrimental to our interests and the interests of our allies and partners, or what I refer to as hollow leadership, where we keep saying the right things, we talk about engaging our allies and partners, but if it's not reflected in practice, if it's not reflected in investment, then our leadership in the region will grow increasingly hollow. So I adopt the language of Silicon Valley, adapt or die. Not to put too dramatic of a point on it, but the idea is that the world is changing, that political dynamics of the Indo-Pacific are changing, and we need to change with it if we're going to be able to continue to have influence and be able to shape the region in a way that's in our interests. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much. I'm excited to have a discussion.
Okay, Abe. There is a lag between the Zoom coverage of your talk and you're actually speaking, and we'll adjust to that. This is a new platform for us at China in the World, but I think it's safe, at least at the outset, for me to ask the first question, since we're on the same time here on the Zoom. And it'll be a little bit of a lengthy question. I agree with a lot of your prescriptions, and I particularly like your distinction between Chinese revisionism and exceptionalism. And I'll just lay out quickly what I think is the terrain on international order, and that is that traditionally in the 21st century, the United States across administrations had been a somewhat revisionist actor in the international order, encouraging the building of new institutions and new ways of cooperating in the international sphere to fit the 21st century globalized world. That manifested itself in various places like the Paris climate change negotiations, responsibility to protect, the Millennium Challenge goals in international development, all the things that basically got inside of countries as part of the cooperation. It softened the sovereignty rules of the international system to deal with the real challenges of a globalized world. And I supported those efforts, so they were somewhat revisionist. China was relatively resistant to almost all of those changes and all those agreements, including an arms control with Iran, arms control sometimes with North Korea. The US was trying to create new institutions, or at least support the creation of new institutions. TPP was the idea of someone else, but the US got on board during the Bush administration and then in the Obama administration to negotiate some kind of deal there. So I saw the United States as sort of constructively revisionist, and China as relatively conservative in the international order. And I still think China is largely conservative in the international order. I just think that when it comes to sovereignty issues, China always wants to carve out exceptions on everything, whether it be human rights in Xinjiang and other places. It doesn't want to get criticism from the outside world, and particularly on sovereignty in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. China has adopted an exceptionalist view that erodes, it doesn't really overturn, but erodes the validity of the international institutions like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in ways that harm those institutions. And that I saw as the sort of traditional landscape in the 21st century between China and the United States in the multilateral sphere and the international order sphere until the Trump administration. And I would say in the Trump administration, the US is more of a revisionist in the following sense, that the US is not only stopping its effort to build new institutions, it's tearing down the old ones. It's attacking the World Health Organization. It's violating the WTO on a regular basis. It's pulling out of the Paris climate change accords. It's pulling out of the Iran deal unilaterally. And it's really the US that's been more revisionist. So I like your prescriptions, and I'll get to my question now. I like your prescriptions of returning to that earlier era of the Bush administration, the Obama administration, where the US got into the business of updating and revising multilateral institutions and cooperation, sometimes without China because China can't qualify for the organization, but often with China. If China's willing to play by the rules, great. That's a big win by your own analysis. So bring them in if you can. But I just wonder now, in American domestic politics, this is really where my question lies, is there a stomach for this? Is Donald Trump the maverick who's tearing down international institutions against the will of, against the US national interest as seen by the majority of American citizens? Or has the US public changed its view of this kind of globalist international multilateral agenda that really has, I agree with you, provided a tremendous amount of American power and influence in East Asia and around the world? It hasn't come at our expense, but it's not really viewed that way. Outside of maybe our discussion, you know, two people who served in the government in the earlier era, who believed in those principles, who lived by them and still believe in them. Can we convince anyone else? And if so, how to do it? You know, maybe Trump is the effect, not the cause, of a change in American attitudes about the role of the United States in the international environment and what the United States should and shouldn't be doing. So I worry about that because I support almost all of your prescriptions. They're very consistent with some of the prescriptions I've written about in the past, and I think they're extremely well articulated. It's a great start for our year to have you present this excellent talk about your excellent book. But I wonder, you know, can we make it work and how? And how do you sell it? Here we are in an election year. How do you sell your ideas in the current political environment in the United States without looking like an old thinker, like me?
No, well, the gray hair is making it harder and harder to look not like an old thinker. It's a terrific question. Traditionally, it was the Democratic Party that was skeptical about free trade agreements, and it was the Republican Party that was more pro-free trade. So President Trump is something of an exception there in his skepticism of free trade. And you know, President Trump pulled the United States out of the TPP negotiations, but it's also worth saying that the Obama administration failed to get TPP through when it was in power, and it couldn't convince its own constituency to approve that as well. So I think my answer to you is, I think, twofold. First is that it's very dependent on the specific issue. I think that issues like climate change, international development, arms control, those pieces I think are still have a lot of support in segments of the American populace and in segments of American politics. There's a segment of people who will vote against anything that has the word United Nations in it, or any hint of loss of sovereignty. But I don't think that's true broadly speaking. I think there is still a lot of appetite for international institutions and laws and norms in a lot of these different areas. Trade is going to be tricky. Cyber is going to be tricky. Information management, information security is going to be tricky. But I do think that there is some appetite still for that. In terms of selling it, I think when we talk about these pieces, I think we spend too much time talking about why it's good for the world and not why it's good for America. In that, you know, TPP, you know, I actually testified on Congress to Congress about TPP, and was very explicit that I'm not an economist and I cannot make an economic case because I'm not competent to do that. But it makes a good strategic case. But I think if we're going to talk about trade, we need to make the trade argument before we make the strategic argument, and explain why it's good for American farmers, for American businesses, for American manufacturers, as well as for people with an interest in climate change or labor rights, those sorts of things. But on other pieces, and I think where it's easier to get China involved is when it's in broader national interests. There's an old story during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, when we were trying to get the first space treaty signed with the Soviet Union. They objected to any sense that space would be an international area. They wanted, you know, sovereignty up to Alpha Centauri, right? But once they figured out that they could put a satellite up there and spy on the United States, then they were on board. Similarly, China was very skeptical about arms control agreements at first, but eventually when they saw that it was in their interest, they gradually started to sign on to some of them. So showing that it's in their interests is a key part of it. And the last point I'll make, which is related to that in terms of engaging and cooperating with China, the Chinese are extremely skilled. Tom, as you well know, the Chinese are extremely skilled at using our efforts to cooperate with them as leverage. And you know, I've seen it innumerable times of, you know, how can we work with you on Iran if you're still, you know, selling weapons to Taiwan or meeting with the Dalai Lama or whatever it is that we're doing that they object to. And the key, I think, for the United States there is to not play that game, is to cooperate, not because it's a favor to us, but because it's in their interest as it is in ours. That we're going to do what we got to do, and be that competitive or cooperative. Those are not mutually exclusive ideas, and that we're probably going to be intensifying both as we go ahead. But in terms of moving ahead on some of the things that I think are important, be it TPP or whatever its successor arrangement would be, or finally ratifying UNCLOS, we need to make a key argument about why it's in the United States' interest to do that, not from a strategic sense, but from an economic and political sense.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely, and I'll just follow up because I don't see questions on the board right now, but I think it works both ways. I think there are many Americans who argue that if we have tensions over Taiwan or if we have tensions over the South China Sea, that we shouldn't seek cooperation with China on climate change or some other issue, because after all, the environment isn't conducive to a cooperative relationship with a country that is clearly trying to do things that we don't like. So I think it's absolutely true in the Chinese diplomatic playbook that It's usually phrased in the terms of the atmosphere is not conducive to cooperation on an issue because the atmosphere has been spoiled by what you did elsewhere. But I think our public and our domestic politics are also capable of allowing tensions over one issue to prevent cooperation over others. And one of the things that I really find frustrating is that I made this argument for a long time. I agree with you entirely on TPP. The U.S. would have benefited greatly economically and strategically from going forward with it. I don't think strategically so much, except that pulling out of it unilaterally really hurt us strategically, because a lot of our partners and allies were involved in that process and made some domestically controversial maneuvers to get on board with TPP. And then we just kind of said, never mind. So that hurt our relationship with those allies. But when I look at TPP, I think, boy, that's kind of quaint to think maybe we could get back into TPP negotiations. But the WTO is under fire from both parties. And the WTO, the Chinese accession to the WTO, I stand by my position that that was an unadulterated good for the United States, for China to join the WTO in 2000, 2001, because the US market was already wide open to Chinese products. And what WTO accession did was open up Chinese markets to US products. And that's why US exports to China grew faster after WTO accession than Chinese imports from into the United States. It was just a good deal. But for some reason, that is considered blasphemy to make the argument that the WTO accession was a good thing. And now everyone's attacking the WTO. So that's why I remain somewhat skeptical. And I ask it in an honest way because I want to make that argument convincing at home as well. So I ask, how do we sell this? That this is really in America's interest. And the last part is, we haven't fought a major war in East Asia, as you said, since the Cold War. I mean, I might say the Korean War was a fight between the US and the PRC, two large powers. But we haven't fought a major power war in Asia since the end of the Cold War. It's a long run now. And I think one of the reasons is the strong interdependence in the region, the globalization that's occurred there, the transnational production chain between all of these actors. They would pay such a heavy price to fight over these rocks and reefs. And I think that if that interdependence didn't exist, we very well may have conflict in East Asia over those sovereignty disputes. And a lot of that was facilitated, again, by China joining the WTO, reducing the likelihood of a US-China trade war, and getting countries to invest in China as part of that transnational production chain. So I think it's been a success, but it takes more than a bumper sticker to sell it. And I wonder if you have some clever ways of convincing people who are skeptical about the benefits of these agreements that the United States and China signed on to in the past as an argument for something that's helped America and Americans at home and has reduced potential opportunity costs that would be there if those agreements weren't made.
Yeah, well, it's very well put. A lot of these institutions, I think, are in pretty significant need of reform. WTO being one of them. The counter argument to you about the WTO ascension, that it allowed China to grow more powerful, and now that they're powerful, they're causing so much of a problem. I think will need to be addressed as part of this debate. I think it speaks to broader questions of the purpose of U.S.-China relations, which is still undefined, and really has been since the end of the Cold War. But to me, avoiding war is a pretty good objective if we can't find anything better since then. WTO, I think, needs a lot of reform, just in terms of its structure, in terms of the fact that the Chinese can get away with pretending to be a developing country, even though they're the second largest economy in the world. Dispute mechanisms have been allowed to lie dormant. It requires a lot of energy and investment in terms of focus and political energy. And I'd say that if we could devise, I'm sure that we can devise a vision for the WTO that would be much more effective in terms of promoting our values and being compatible with our interests. But ultimately, in those international organizations, the United States has a limited number of votes. We have a limited amount of sway. But if we're able to engage and partner with our allies and partners on these pieces, the argument of this book is that we'll be much more effective. That it's not just a unilateral US-China thing, but it's really China against the world. I think we'll be much more effective by taking that approach, that these institutions need reform. These institutions need to be updated and revitalized to address current economic realities, current political realities. So let's do that. And reform is part of the package of re-engagement.
Right.
To me, that's
So,
a good
I
argument.
agree with you. And if you look at the history of the TPP, that's really, there's certain narratives and myths about the past in U.S. foreign policy. And one of them is that the TPP was an Obama administration idea as part of the pivot to Asia. And this is just historical revisionism. The TPP was the idea of 4 regional actors who were frustrated that the Doha round of the WTO wasn't moving forward, and they wanted to come up with a different idea. One of those actors was Singapore, and the Bush administration was really interested in the TPP initially because Singapore was involved, and the Bush administration had signed a very good bilateral free trade agreement with Singapore, what we call the gold standard. It was Robert Zellick had done it in the first term, and it was considered the gold standard. And in the second term, these 4 members of APEC in the Asia-Pacific came up with this idea for TPP for the major economies. And it included investment and intellectual property protections, the kind of things we wanted to reform WTO to include. So we got interested in it. And I can remember the strategy, and it gets at some of the elements of your talk. The strategy of entering those talks in 2008, I was in the government at the time, was to get the major economies of the Asia-Pacific together for a gold standard agreement, make China jealous that they weren't included because they couldn't meet the standards right away, and then get China to open up so that it could get over its jealousy and join the organization over time, maybe in phases, maybe all at once. And the outcome would be a more open and rule-based China and a more open and rule-based region, and everybody would be a winner, including China. It wasn't seen as a way of kind of containing China. It wasn't seen, as Ash Carter said, as another aircraft carrier in the region. It just morphed into something else. I think in large part, again, to get back to the earlier question, because it's more compelling to an American audience to say, this will increase American power at China's expense. So it's an aircraft carrier, and it maybe get people behind the agreement. But yeah, we need World Trade Organization 2.0. And my strong sense is the current environment is the European Union is the real actor that's pushing for WTO 2.0 right now. China likes WTO 1.0 for all the reasons you cited. They have all these exceptions, and they can avoid various things that harm their state capitalist model. And the US is tearing at 1.0. Is attacking 1.0, saying it was a mistake, and that puts us as the most retrograde actor on international trade, which I find incredibly painful. That China is ahead of us in a sense. They're supporting at least the existing institutions to some degree, while the U.S. is attacking them, and everybody is ignoring the EU efforts to create a reform 2.0 WTO system that addresses all the needs of globalization and investment and intellectual property and cyber and all these other things.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is, China is trying to position itself as, the protector of globalization, the protector of internationalism, where the reality is that their own economy is incredibly closed off and incredibly backward and inconsistent with the principles of globalization or political liberalism itself. But they see it as a the current system as beneficial to them, as you said. And they can get away with that hypocrisy because the United States isn't there to push back. And we're not pushing back as effectively as we could be. The only point you've made before that I wanted to comment on, you talked about Chinese emphasis on sovereignty, and that China has this allergy when it comes to sovereignty. That explains it. What I think is important to note is that they're very sensitive to their sovereignty, not so much to other countries' sovereignty. When it comes to their intellectual, their political interference programs of interfering with democratic systems around the world, the new national security law that potentially makes it so that people who are critical of China's policies in Hong Kong could be liable even if they don't live in Hong Kong. The extraterritoriality of some of their other laws and policies, expecting countries and corporations to be in line with Chinese policies, forcing United Airlines to change how they list Taipei, yeah. Their influence in Hollywood, all those things.
Right. So let me respond to you, Abe, because I have a new paper out. Yeah, I have it's exceptionalist, but I have a paper out at the Asan Institute. It came out last week, and I invite you to look at that and my take on these things. I agree that all those things are troubling behavior by China, the influence attempts, particularly troubling as an academic because it gets at academic freedom and it gets at issues that are really important to free institutions. But at the same time, I really think that those influence attempts have been very different from, say, Russian influence attempts in Eastern Europe, in that they're trying to influence those countries' attitudes and policies toward China's sovereignty claims. In other words, they're not trying to undercut democracy as an institution. They're trying to make the democracy stop criticizing the mainland over its policy towards Taiwan, the mainland towards its policy towards Hong Kong, the mainland towards its policy in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, which I see as very different than a kind of revisionist strategy like Mao had, where he was trying to overthrow governments abroad by supporting rebels who wanted to create communist regimes inside those countries. And I think they get conflated. Russia and China get put together in current Pentagon documents and in national security documents at the White House as if they're doing the same thing. And I don't like what China's doing. I think we need to be vigilant, particularly in academia, about what China's trying to achieve. But I don't see it as the same type of challenge or threat to democracy that I do an evangelical authoritarian regime would be doing. And it's a possibility that China will go down that route. And if it does, I think we'll actually have a Cold War with China. But I don't think it's trying to do it now. And that's why I think the strategic competition is closer to the way you described it. Because if China starts to export authoritarianism, we will be able to get allies to choose. They'll be threatened, their regimes will be threatened by China directly, and they will choose the United States, and we'll have a whole block of countries like Secretary Pompeo calls for in his China speech in late July. But I don't think China's trying to do that, and most of our allies don't think China's trying to do that. So we're not going to get them on board for that. China's more being annoying and eroding some of the institutions that matter to us in this process, but it's not trying to export the China model around the world, with the possible exception of North Korea, where they really want North Korea to open up to the outside world and trade, and they have for decades wanted North Korea to do that. I don't really see China trying to create single-party state capitalist systems. I see their arguments abroad as saying, our system is legitimate. We're doing well. Look how well we're doing. Leave us alone. Stop trying to change our regime. Stop trying to do color revolutions. Stop trying to encourage democracy in Hong Kong. Get out of our country. And now, I'm a revisionist, so I'll just finish by saying I'm a revisionist. I believe in the spread of democracy, right? Revisionism isn't necessarily a bad word, but I see China still as basically conservative on these principles. And I wish the United States, frankly, would get back to the business of being an example of democracy at home for other countries to look at, and also being more active in trying to spread our values abroad. So I'm an unabashed unapologetic revisionist. But I don't think China is all that revisionist now. It is doing things that we need to be vigilant about, however.
I think you're right. I think I like that you describe them as evangelical, and that they're not, trying to promote Xi Jinping thought around as Mao did. We know what a revolutionary China looks like in the international system, and that's not what this is. There have been at times talk about the China model being attractive for other countries, but I think my sense is that it's less of an, as you said, evangelical approach to trying to export the system, and more that their sense, and I think it's the right sense, that what they offer is going to be much more attractive to authoritarian regimes than democratic governments.
Right.
That they're going to be able to get more business done with Cambodia than with New Zealand, for example. Mm-hmm. But a lot of what they have been up to in Australia, in New Zealand, in the United States, of course, very different from what Russia is doing. I call it it's more less interference and more influence. Although some of the things that they've done in Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan definitely crossed the line, into my mind. But not necessarily compatible with
sure. Just to be clear, Taiwan.
But of course, they don't see that. Yeah.
They want to destroy democracy in Taiwan, just like they want to destroy democracy in Hong Kong. But they can think that's theirs.
Sure, but definitely not consistent with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
Not with Taiwan, but that never applied to Taiwan, right?
But Australia.
Yeah, right. States. No, they interfere, but again, I think they're interfering for a specific purpose, and I find it something to be vigilant about. But in those cases, again, I think they're trying to interfere to affect the policies of those countries on the sovereignty issues themselves. And when China talks about the China model, this is interpretive, and I could be wrong, but I see it again as more defensive. They're trying to say that our model is legitimate, it is successful. And then when you get to authoritarian regimes, they're very comfortable with authoritarian regimes in a way that most American administrations aren't. But the current administration seems very comfortable with authoritarian regimes around the world, and even in North Korea. So the U.S. has kind of stopped spreading democracy. And when the U.S. starts doing it again, the thing I'm most concerned about with China is a little bit different, which is China's exporting the technology of repression. It's exporting surveillance equipment. It's exporting surveillance of the internet techniques to authoritarian regimes. And since I am a revisionist and believe in the spread of democracy, it concerns me that China is going to be in the business of selling equipment and training authoritarian regimes on how to prevent color revolutions. That is an ideological struggle, but it's a little bit different than the Cold War, where Mao and Stalin were trying to spread communism around the world, but it's still very troubling to someone who believes in the spread of democracy.
Yeah, and I actually wrote a piece in War on the Rocks in June with my colleague Matt Rajansky, talking about the role not only of the United States living up to its ideals internationally, but also at home, and how that affects American power in the world. So yeah, I completely agree about living our values and being an advocate for human rights and democracy around the world as part of our foreign policy. I think you can't really separate the two, and it's especially critical when it comes to international order and our competition with China.
Yeah, and it's the right thing to do because democracy is good, and so I can defend that position.
It has the added benefit of being good to do.
Yeah. So what worries me now is the 2020 election, and I'm not talking about who wins it necessarily. All this doubt that's being cast on the legitimacy of the democratic election process is not doing us any providing any help to the U.S. message abroad about the superiority of democracy. The idea that a standing president has already called into question the legitimacy of the election if he loses. I can't recall anything like that in my lifetime.
One of the consistent questions I've been hearing from Asian counterparts since President Trump's inauguration has been questioning whether or not President Trump represents a fundamental change in America, or if he's a bit of an outlier. And post-Trump, whether that be in 2021 or in 2025, if the United States will go back to go back to the way things were. And my sense is that President Trump is pretty distant from where most of the American people are when it comes to foreign affairs, especially. And there's a lot of polling that shows American support for alliances and trade and international institutions and leadership. But polling doesn't matter. It's elections that matter. And I think we're going to see a lot about the role of the United States and how Americans value these issues in the upcoming election. And it's going to send a very clear message to our allies, to our partners, and to our adversaries about what the American people care about, what we don't care about, and the role that we want to play in the world.
Yeah, I agree. And I just hope that whatever happens, it happens smoothly and with some transparency. I also worry about domestic violence in and around the election time from militia groups and things like that. All that paints democracy as something very worrisome to people in the developing world. They've seen instability. They don't like it. It's not a very good marketing technique for liberal democracy if elections lead to domestic unrest and some violence.
I'm worried about it too. What gives me optimism though, and some people may call me naive, but I still have faith in the American people that the vast majority of us are going to do the right thing.
Yeah,
and that we can't let a few of those folks speak for us, and that we can speak louder than those folks who may try to disrupt things.
Yeah, and the other thing that I try to tell my foreign students, which is very powerful, is that you and I, when we swore into our positions at the Pentagon and the State Department, didn't swear allegiance to the president or to the flag. We swore allegiance to the Constitution. And even more important than civilians like us, that's what every military officer does. And I try to convince them that these people really believe in that pledge, and they will defend the Constitution. So there may be violence, but there's not going to be a regime change. The military won't allow it. They'll support the Constitution, and we still have the Supreme Court to support that Constitution. And these institutions really matter. And that gives me hope that the country will be fine. I do think that in terms of marketing liberal democracy abroad in developing countries, any kind of social unrest and chaos after an election is a bad deal.
Absolutely, yeah. I need to stay nonpartisan in my Wilson Center function, and you're really challenging me to stay nonpartisan here.
Hey, well, listen, I'm nonpartisan. I've been an independent my whole life. I served in a Republican administration. I did sign on to this Republican national security officials for Biden, which is an out-of-body experience for me to state who I was going to vote for publicly. But I think a criticism of this aspect of President Trump's treatment of the election is very different from saying who should win the election or which party should prevail in the Senate.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so it is 6 o'clock, and this turned into a conversation which I really enjoyed after your excellent talk. You've kicked off our year, so this is going to be on the Weatherhead Center Weatherhead Institute website, East Asia Institute website, and people can look at it for a long time to come. And I hope that it gets the word out about your excellent book, which I look forward to reading. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. And I hope a lot of the students who chime in and look at your talk will also look at the book and learn from your wisdom. Great pleasure to see you again. Congratulations on your expanding family. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. And we look forward to staying in touch in the future.
Thanks so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.